Good morning. Thank you all for being here today. I'd like to thank Tom for that introduction. And also I'd like to thank Bob Hope for inviting me to speak here today, and all of you for being here. It's really good to see you. Thank you so much. I know that we're all eager to hear about this upcoming election. So let's go ahead and get to it. A little bit of information about me. Tom ran through most of this, so I'll just leave it up for a minute. Maybe hard to believe that I don't particularly like to talk about myself. Oh, wait, that's actually not true. I really do. So that could go on for a while if I got going. So I'm just going to go ahead and get right past that and get right to it. So here's how it's going to go today. I'm going to run through everything starting with the presidential election and work my way down all the way to the state legislative races. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those. I'm mostly going to focus on the federal races. And then at the end, I'm going to try to open it up for about 15 minutes worth of questions so that you can ask me whatever you like, challenge me on whatever you like. I respond well to challenges for the most part. So we'll see how that goes. So let's get right to it. Let's take a look at the presidential election. Of course, this is the big enchilada, and we know that it's very, very unusual. We've never seen anything like it before. With any luck, we'll never see anything like it again. But we have here certainly a very, very historic presidential election. I know that you'll recall that in 2008, the election had a very historic nature. This year, there are some definite historic overtones as well. Hillary Clinton is set to be the first woman nominated by a major party for president. And Donald Trump is set to be the first candidate with no relevant experience nominated for president. But also, we have unusually two of the oldest candidates for president who have ever been nominated. Donald Trump, if he does win, would be the oldest president ever inaugurated at 70 years old, and Hillary Clinton would be the second oldest. And both candidates enter this election with astonishing disapproval ratings. So everybody's excited for this election, right? Wrong. Nobody's excited for this election. We have two candidates who are completely unpopular, disliked, and not trusted by the public. You look at Hillary Clinton. Her approval rating, on average, according to the Real Clear Politics average, is under 40%. Nobody gets elected with numbers like these. Her net negatives are 16%. She's got a 56% average disapproval rating. Absolute electoral doom, right? Wrong. Donald Trump's average approval rating is 33%. He's 28% underwater. Hillary Clinton has to be one of the luckiest people alive. She's drawn the one Republican candidate she can actually beat. And I mean, honestly, I really believe that if the Republican Party had nominated virtually anybody else, she would have almost no chance to win this election for several reasons. Of course, her approval ratings are bad, but also historically, it is very, very difficult for one party to win the White House 3 terms in a row. It's happened one time since 1948. So really, Hillary Clinton has really lucked out in drawing perhaps the one candidate who she actually would be favored to defeat in November. Now, first things first, we have a couple things coming up in the next couple of weeks, the Republican and Democratic National Conventions. We've gotten to a point in American politics where the conventions are usually snoozers. This could be different. As I was reading the headlines this morning, there are still elements of the Republican Party who are trying to find some way to derail the Trump nomination in Cleveland next week. This is not going to happen. The delegates who are there are pledged to him. They're ready to vote for him. It is very, very unlikely that there are going to be the kinds of rules changes that would be necessary to derail his nomination. The Democratic Convention, there's been some concern about disruptions by Bernie Sanders supporters who really, really do not like Hillary Clinton. In some of the state conventions, there were major disruptions by Sanders supporters who were displeased with the choice of Hillary Clinton. So we could see some fireworks at these conventions that we don't normally see, but we'll find out in the next couple of weeks. Now, a little background. I'm not going to assume any level of knowledge or lack of knowledge, but to go through how the president is actually elected. I think if you ask a lot of people, they'll say, it's who got the most votes. Actually not true. It's a very convoluted system handed down to us by the founders, whereby each state gets a certain number of electors, basically based on population, more or less. California, the highest populated state, gets 55 of these electors. The lowest populated states get a minimum of 3. And generally speaking, what happens is when you win a state, you get every one of the electors. Whether you win by 1 vote or 10 million votes, you get all the electors for that state. There are a couple of exceptions. Maine and Nebraska split their electors. You get 2 electors for winning the state, and you get 1 elector for each congressional district. In 2008, Nebraska actually did split, with Barack Obama getting 1 electoral vote out of Omaha. A candidate has to win 270 of the 538 electoral votes to win the election. If you get 269 and nobody else, well, if you got 269, nobody could get 270 because it would be 269, 269. If nobody has 270, the House of Representatives picks the president. That has not happened in a very long time. The last time was 1824. But the other thing to keep in mind is that even if you have more votes than the other candidate, if you have fewer electoral votes, the other candidate gets 270, that candidate wins. We saw that happen in 2000 and on a couple of other occasions, but it's very, very rare. Typically, whoever wins the most votes does win the election. Moving on, I'd like to kind of set the scene by going through very briefly how these states typically have lined up over the last 6 election cycles. If you look at this map, you'll see that there are a number of states that are in blue, a number of states that are in red, various shades. The darkest states have gone Democratic or Republican in each of the last 6 elections and would generally be considered pretty safe for one party or the other unless this election is some sort of unprecedented landslide. If you go down one gradation of color, the next level down in terms of red and blue states, these states have gone for the party that they are identified with, red for Republican, blue for Democratic, in 5 of the last 6 elections. Pretty reliable, could go in a landslide. And if you look at the ones that are the lightest shade of blue and the pink, these are the ones that have gone for their party 4 of the last 6 elections. There are only 2 states in the entire country that have been an even split in the last 6 elections, Florida and Colorado, 3-3 each time. And now, to go into a little of my own prognostications. This is how I see the map as we stand right now, based on historical data, based on polling, based on my knowledge of electoral politics and history over the years. Again, the darker states are the safer states, the lighter states are the ones that are more up for grabs, and the ones that aren't colored one way or another, you'll see that Florida, Ohio, Virginia, and North Carolina are not colored one way or another, would be what I would consider to be true toss-up states that could go either way. At this point in time, you'll see some numbers up at the top of the screen. Democrat 272, Republican 191. If everything holds the way I see it right now, Hillary Clinton already has enough electoral votes to win the election if everything holds. A better way of putting that would be that Donald Trump is going to have to turn at least one of these states that are colored blue to red, or he's done. To break this down a little bit more, I'm going to put up a map here indicating the states that I, at this point, consider to be safe for one party or another, unless this turns into some sort of Ronald Reagan 49-state landslide, which I do not anticipate. The states that you see colored on this particular map right now are very, very likely, almost 100% likely, to go either blue for Democrats or red for Republicans in November. And if this is the case, we see that Hillary Clinton starts out with 190 safe electoral votes. She needs 80 more to win. Donald Trump starts out with 133 and would need 137 more to win. So he has a tougher path than Hillary Clinton does when you look at the states that are pretty much already off the board. Going to the next level, we're going to take a look at some states that theoretically could flip but probably aren't going to. And I have a few states identified on this map. You will see that in blue I've got Michigan and Minnesota. There's been a lot of talk about Donald Trump being able to really make inroads among white, blue-collar voters, and there are plenty of those in these 2 states, but historically, these states have been pretty solidly Democratic over the last generation, and it would really take a Trump landslide to turn Michigan or Minnesota or that one congressional district in Maine from blue to red. And looking at the states that are in red on this map, there's been a lot of movement demographically in Georgia over the last few years, a lot of people moving in from outside. Barack Obama didn't even really campaign in Georgia, but actually only lost the state by 5 points in 2008 and by about 7 points in 2012. So there are some demographic changes there. I don't think Georgia's there yet, but if it turns out to be a big Hillary Clinton landslide, she could possibly win Georgia. The other states that I have in red, probably much less likely. Indiana did go for Barack Obama in 2008. Big surprise. Indiana goes Democratic about as often as I go to the moon. Missouri is about similar to Indiana right now in terms of its political makeup. Montana was close in 2008. Barack Obama almost carried Montana, but typically Montana's Republican. And I threw Arkansas on here just because I really don't think Arkansas is going to go Democratic. It's highly, highly unlikely. But if it turns into a big Hillary Clinton landslide, perhaps her connections to Arkansas and Bill Clinton's connections to Arkansas might make it competitive. I doubt it, but I have just enough doubt to put that state in this category. Now we're going to get into some of the more interesting states on the map, what I call the battlegrounds. And you'll see that most of these are in blue, because right now where I see it is that most of these states are likelier than not to go Democratic. These will be the states that will be of primary importance if and only if Donald Trump sweeps the 4 toss-up states that I will talk about in a minute. If Trump does win Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida, he's going to have to pick off 1 or 2 of these blue states to win the election. But he's also going to have to watch out for this one red state that I've got down here, which is Arizona. Now, typically Arizona is a Republican state. It has gone for a Democratic candidate once since 1948, and that was 1996 when Bill Clinton won it. Republicans have dominated Arizona since the time of Barry Goldwater, but one of the key things we're going to see in this election is the absolute anger and disgust that the Latino population across the country has for Donald Trump. Arizona, approximately 30% Latino. If Latinos turn out in force, which typically they have not done, and they vote by historic margins for Hillary Clinton, which is entirely possible based on polling, Arizona could be in play. If Trump manages to lose Arizona, his task becomes even more arduous. He'd be looking at having to pick up 2 or 3 of these blue states instead of maybe 1 or 2 of them. And then moving on, as I noted, the 4 states that are pure toss-ups: Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, Virginia. Every one of these states was decided by less than 4% in 2012, and they all appear like they're going to be close again this year. I would say again, given the composition of the electoral map and the advantage that the Democrats start with, that Donald Trump absolutely positively must win every one of these states that are on this map. If he does not sweep these 4 states, then there is really no realistic path for him to win the election. So it all starts here, and if he does manage to win these 4 states, about which I have my doubts, then we go back to the previous map, and he's going to have to pick off 1 or 2 of those blue states as well. So to sum up, I really think there are 8 states you're going to have to keep your eyes on if you want to see how things are going in this election. The 4 toss-ups: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and New Hampshire, and Arizona, on the off chance that it does become competitive due to the Latino vote, possibly trending very heavily against Donald Trump. And to talk a little more about the Latino vote while I'm on that subject, in 2012, Barack Obama won 71% of the Latino vote nationally. Mitt Romney won 27%. That was a near-record performance. Bill Clinton actually did better in 1996 when he got 72%. If you look at the polling right now, and if it holds true to form, Donald Trump can maybe count on somewhere between 14 and 20% of the Latino vote nationally. And again, that's going to be the kind of totals that take competitive states like Colorado and Nevada off the board and possibly put Arizona in play. So again, I think that these are the 8 states that are going to be absolutely crucial in telling you how this presidential election is going to go. So I'm going to go with a little summary here. I believe very strongly at this point that Hillary Clinton does have not just an advantage, but a pretty notable advantage. If you look at the reports we're seeing about Latinos registering and getting naturalized in extremely large numbers this election cycle, particularly in states such as Florida, Colorado, Nevada, where we're seeing notable growth in Democratic registration this cycle. These are very bad signs for Donald Trump and the Republicans. The Puerto Rican population in Florida has been exploding. The fiscal crisis in Puerto Rico has caused a lot of outmigration, and the Puerto Rican population in Florida now exceeds 1 million. And as U.S. citizens, Puerto Ricans do not have to be naturalized in order to vote. They can just move to Florida and sign up to vote. Even in Virginia and North Carolina, there are small but demographically notable Latino populations. If those states are close, they could make a difference. And of course, as I mentioned, Arizona could be competitive this year. I think Arizona is going to be much more competitive than it has been over the last 20 years. And I mentioned earlier the statistic about Mitt Romney losing Latinos. If the polling that we see right now holds, and I think it's a pretty good chance that it could, that's going to be a bigger deficit for Donald Trump in a year in which demographers were expecting that Latino turnout could rise from 11 million last time to 13 million this time, a rise of 2 million Latino votes over the last election, which could be crucial. Looking at other key demographics, typically African-American voters vote Democratic at a 9-to-1 ratio or better. The one exception to that I can think of in recent memory was in 2004 when George W. Bush got an unheard of for a Republican, 11% of the African-American vote, and roughly 16% in Ohio, which ended up being crucial because without Ohio, President Bush would have lost that election. Typically, the black vote is 9-to-1 Democratic or better. Another stat that's going to be very troubling, typically college-educated white voters vote Republican. I know there's a lot of talk about educated people vote Democratic, but college-educated white voters typically vote Republican. The last time this was not true was 1956. So that is a demographic that Mitt Romney won by a convincing margin, roughly about 11, 12 percentage points in 2012. Polling right now is giving Hillary Clinton upwards of an 11, 12-point lead among college-educated white voters. This could be a game changer because typically this is a Republican demographic. So right now, Trump, to have an opportunity to win, is going to need either to change some of these things that I mentioned earlier, which appears unlikely to me, or have just absolutely unheard of increases in turnout among disaffected white blue-collar voters. Now, to give you some perspective, the white blue-collar vote in 2012, about 55% turnout, roughly 62% voted for Romney. Donald Trump would be looking at having to up those numbers to roughly 2/3 in each case. That is a very, very heavy lift. Now, there are some caveats. Of course, we are roughly 4 months out from the election. Many, many things can happen. One of the things that has to be of concern to Hillary Clinton is the trouble that she has had among a large number of Bernie Sanders supporters who do not like her, do not trust her, think of her, believe it or not, as basically being more or less a Republican in Democrats' clothing. I don't think there is any Republican in this room who would agree with that assessment. But there are a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters who really think that she's to the right of Attila the Hun. So there's been polling showing that as many as 1/3 of Sanders' supporters will not support her. They'll stay home. They'll write in Bernie Sanders. They'll vote for the Green Party candidate. It remains to be seen if this is true. There are some hurt feelings. If you go back to 2008, upwards of 40% of Hillary Clinton's voters said they would not vote for Barack Obama, and ultimately they did. The difference there, or what could be the difference, is that typically most of Hillary's voters in 2008 were strongly committed to the Democratic Party and ultimately reconciled themselves to voting for Barack Obama. A lot of the voters Bernie Sanders brought into the process this year don't give a damn about the Democratic Party. They're not interested in the party system. They think the party system is garbage and they want to see it blown up. So whether or not they actually ultimately get in line or not, we don't really know yet. Ultimately, I do believe that a large majority of Sanders supporters will support Hillary Clinton. The question is, what's the margin? And of course, unpredictable events could happen. Some sort of serious economic collapse, major terrorist attack could really scramble things. So there are all kinds of uncertainties. You never know what's going to happen. But looking at what we know right now, I do think Hillary Clinton has a very distinct advantage in the presidential election. So now I'm going to move on and I'm going to talk about one thing that is very, very crucial here. The presidential election is going to determine who has the balance on the Supreme Court. With the death of Justice Scalia, conservatives and liberals on the court are evenly split 4-4. This is the first time there has not been a conservative majority on the court in over a generation. The Republicans in the Senate have refused to fill this seat while Barack Obama is president because they understand something that is very simple arithmetically. There is a 0% chance that they are going to have a conservative Supreme Court if they approve President Obama's pick. There is, if you figure that their candidate has at least a 40% to win the election, a 40% chance or better that they will have a conservative Supreme Court if they wait until after the election's over. So they're going to sit on this, and the only thing that might change this is if Hillary Clinton does in fact win the election and they decide, you know, Merrick Garland doesn't sound so bad after all. He's kind of a moderate, and he's kind of old, so he might not be around for a long time. Let's go ahead and approve him before Hillary Clinton can appoint Elizabeth Warren, Huey Long, or whatever other liberal that she might put on the court. So basically, one of the most key things about this election is going to be what happens with the Supreme Court. If Hillary Clinton wins, it's going to be a liberal Supreme Court for the first time since the early 70s, the late 60s. If Donald Trump wins, theoretically it could be a conservative Supreme Court, or he could appoint his butler. Who knows? Moving on from the presidential race, I want to talk a little bit about the congressional races. The United States Senate, the Republicans currently control the chamber 54 to 46. They picked up 9 seats in 2014 to wipe out Democratic control of the Senate. Now, there are 34 seats that are up for election this November. Roughly 1/3 of the seats are on the ballot every 2 years to serve a 6-year term. And the Republicans are really at a disadvantage because they are defending 24 of these 34 seats. And a number of these seats are very, very vulnerable. They're going to be very, very close. Already 2 Republican senators in Illinois and Wisconsin are considered very likely to lose their reelection bids. And you've got several toss-up states. One that just got added to the list this week, Indiana, was looking like a pretty safe hold for the Republicans until the Democratic candidate in Indiana dropped out of the race, and the Democrats brought back a very popular former governor and senator named Evan Bayh, turning what seemed like an almost certain Republican hold into an absolute toss-up. So we're looking at very, very close Senate races in Florida, Indiana, New Hampshire, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and possible vulnerabilities for the Republicans in seats they hold in Arizona and North Carolina, maybe even Iowa and Missouri if the election turns into a complete Democratic landslide. On the other side, the Democrats are only defending 10 seats. 8 of these are absolutely safe. No chance in hell they're going to lose any of those 8. Theoretically, Michael Bennet in Colorado could have a tough race, but he's favored. The only toss-up on the Democratic side is in Nevada, where longtime Senator Harry Reid is stepping down, and there's a very, very competitive race between Joe Heck on the Republican side and Catherine Cortez Masto on the Democratic side. I think that's probably going to be your most interesting Senate race in the country this year, and I think that heavy Latino turnout and Democratic performance could help the Democrats hold on to that seat. So to take a look at the likeliest scenarios, and I have a very similar map here. The states that are in white do not have Senate elections this year. That's the key difference. But here's how I see the current situation with who's likely to win these Senate races in these states. The ones that are in kind of tan are the ones that I consider the toss-up races, and those are the 6 races that are going to determine which party has control of the Senate in 2017. Now, going through what I mentioned earlier, the absolute worst thing that could happen for the Democrats, if this turns into a bad election for them, they could lose 2 seats. They could lose Nevada, they could lose Colorado. On the other side, the Republicans are really overexposed, and if this election really goes south, Hillary Clinton wins upwards of 30, 35 states, you could see the Democrats pick up as many as 11 seats. I don't think that's very likely. I think they're likelier to pick up in the range of 6 or 7. But if it turns into a really, really bad result for the Republicans, you could be seeing the Democrats approaching filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. I don't think that's likely, but it's possible. Now, the outcome is going to be very, very closely linked to what happens in the presidential race, and I'll explain why in a moment. Since the turn of the 21st century, there have been 20 Senate races in states that were decided by 7 percentage points or less in the presidential race. Now, what you'll find is that in one of these closely contested states, 70% of the time, the party that wins the state in the presidential race also wins the Senate race. But this has become more pronounced in the last 2 cycles. There have been 11 Senate races in states that were decided by 7 percentage points or less in the presidential race. 9 of those went to the same party that won the presidential race. There has become a tendency among American voters to split their tickets less and less as we become more polarized and more partisan. So if, say for instance, Pennsylvania goes Democratic in the presidential election, there's a good chance Pennsylvania is going to elect a Democratic senator as well. So the presidential coattails really do matter in the Senate races. So to take a look at the states that I think are going to determine how the Senate is going to turn out, you've got 5 in the eastern part of the country, all in red: Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and New Hampshire, and the 1 blue state in the west, Nevada. Now again, statistically speaking, the party that wins these states in the presidential race typically wins the Senate races as well. So I think that what you're going to see is whoever wins the presidency is going to win most of these states that are on the map, and their Senate candidate for their party is also going to win most of these states on the map. But this is where I believe that Senate control is going to be decided in 2012. So those are your 6 states to watch. And what I just talked to you about is why I wrote a column a couple months ago in the New York Observer in which I said, look, the fears we're hearing from Republicans in Washington about what could happen to the Republican Senate majority if Donald Trump gets absolutely wiped out in November is very well justified, because these two things are very closely linked. So let's move over to the House of Representatives. Republicans have a commanding lead, 247 to 188. This is the largest Republican majority in the House of Representatives since the Great Depression. Almost impossible to expect that the Democrats are going to win control of the House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi has been hanging on to her seat for years, thinking she's going to get the speakership back. I give that maybe a 5% chance of happening. A month ago, I would have given it a 0% chance. The only chance for the Democrats is if this election turns into a complete disaster for the Republicans, and a lot of Republicans who are disenchanted with Donald Trump just flat out stay home. Republicans who come out and vote for Hillary Clinton, which probably won't be a very high number, are probably going to vote Republican down ballot to balance things out. There are a lot of stay-at-homes that could change the game. There are a lot of very competitive suburban districts around New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, where Democrats could make some inroads. But the best case scenario for the Democrats may be that they pick up 15, possibly at the outside 20 seats, and I think that even that's a pretty heavy lift. They lost 13 in 2014. Now, where you're going to be looking for key House districts, there were a number of very close races in 2014, 5 races that were still undecided after the election. These could end up being very close again. But I think what's really going to be interesting is that you have 28 House districts that voted for Obama in 2012, but they're currently represented by the Republican Party. This is where Democrats could really, really make some inroads. 6 of them in New York State alone, 4 more in Florida, a couple each in California, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Nevada, and New Jersey, and a few others scattered across the country. There are only 5 House seats currently represented by Democrats that voted for Mitt Romney, a couple of those in Florida, and then 1 in Arizona, 1 in Minnesota, 1 in Nebraska. There's a lot more room here for the Democrats to grow their numbers, but still probably not enough for them to get to the 30 they would need to take over the House. Now, if you want to look at where you're going to have the largest number of key House races, or potentially at least, New York, as I just mentioned, is going to have quite a few. California has a number of very close districts. And Florida, as per usual, and as Fred could tell you, is going to be ground zero. 5 potential key House races, closely contested Senate race, and closely contested presidential race. So if you really, really love campaign ads, you might want to move to Florida for the next 4 months. Here's the big picture. Democrats absolutely have more opportunities to make gains. There's no question about that. The Republicans really don't have a lot of opportunities either in the House or the Senate to pick off Democratic seats. But historically, for the Democrats to make gains in an election like this would run counter to form. Over the last 150 years, there have only been 3 elections in which the incumbent president's party won control of at least 1 chamber of Congress, which the opposing party held going into the election, and only once has the incumbent president's party actually won control of both houses that the other party held going in, and that was in 1948. It usually does not happen. It's a very, very rare thing to see happen. But then again, this is an unusual election, and we've never seen anything like it. It's a tough haul. I think that the Democrats can reclaim the Senate. I think it's very, very difficult to see how they get the House. They could tighten things up considerably. Now moving on into the state level races. There are only a handful of governor's races this year. Most states decide to hold their governor's races in off-year elections so that the result of their gubernatorial elections are not in any way determined by what happens in the presidential race. Currently, Republicans have a 30-19 edge. The independents control Alaska's governorship. You'll see on this map that there are darker states and lighter states. The states that are in lighter colors, the current governor is not running again. And Indiana there could be lighter colored after today or tomorrow because there are a number of news reports coming out this morning that Donald Trump is going to select Indiana Governor Mike Pence as his running mate, in which case that would also become an open seat. You'll see that there are a number of lighter states that are in blue: Missouri, West Virginia, Delaware, New Hampshire, Vermont. One light red state where North Dakota's governor is not running again. The other states all have incumbent governors who are seeking re-election. Republican incumbents are very vulnerable in Indiana and North Carolina. Those could be very close races. Democratic open seats are vulnerable in Missouri, New Hampshire, and West Virginia. And then taking a look at some of the legislative chambers that I think could potentially be in play. In most cases, it's because they're already very, very closely divided. In some cases, they're not, but there's a history of large swings. But the listing here of the various legislative chambers that I think could be very, very interesting. So if you live in any of these states, you might want to pay very close attention to what's happening in the legislative races in your states. And with that, I'm going to make a few predictions. I will caution you that for some portion of the people in the room, I expect this might ruin your appetite, and with lunch coming up, might not be a bad idea to duck out for a few minutes. No, I'm kidding, you definitely shouldn't duck out. But here we go. Now, this is being captured on videotape, and you all have seen this, so when all this blows up in a few months, I can't deny it. But here's how I see things right now. Here's your next president. I think that Hillary Clinton is in a very strong position in the Electoral College. I think that she is very fortunate in the opponent that she has drawn. And I think that she wins by a very similar margin to Barack Obama in 2012, also picking up North Carolina and one electoral vote in Nebraska, and perhaps others. There's a lot of talk about Trump expanding the map. I think he's going to expand the map, certainly. I think he's going to expand it for Hillary Clinton. I do not see him really making inroads. There's a lot of talk about Pennsylvania being close. But Democrats start out with such a large margin out of Philadelphia that it's very, very difficult for the rest of the state to overcome it. The same is true with Wisconsin and Madison and Milwaukee. Wisconsin has gone Democratic in every election since 1984. It's been very close on some occasions, but it has gone Democratic. The same thing with Pennsylvania. I really don't see Donald Trump winning those states in the end. I think that the United States Senate, following with Hillary Clinton winning the presidency, will flip to Democratic control in 2017. I see Democrats picking up no fewer than a net of 6 seats from the Republicans. In the House of Representatives, I think it's probably is too light of a word, almost certainly remains in Republican hands, barring some colossal landslide for the Democrats. But I could see the 30-seat Republican majority reduced to 10 to 15 seats. As far as governorships, I think it's going to be a wash. I think you're going to see Republicans lose one of their vulnerable governorships, maybe both. But the Democrats also are likely to lose some of the seats they have, particularly West Virginia, which has moved very, very hard right in the last decade or so. I do see Democrats gaining some traction in the state legislatures, where currently Republicans have a massive edge, controlling 69 of the 99 legislative chambers across the country. Political gravity, if nothing else, is going to help the Democrats pick up some of those chambers this year. I see them picking up at least 8 legislative chambers across the country, possibly more. And so with that, I would like to open it up for questions. We have about 15 minutes before lunch. Anybody who would like me to expand on anything I've said here or has a question about anything I haven't addressed, the floor is yours. Chapin.
Thanks, Cliston. How do you see the Libertarian Party affecting the presidential election?
You know, right now we're seeing Gary Johnson polling in double digits in some polls. I would caution that typically, if you go back over the history of American politics, you look at how independent and third-party candidates have performed in their polling in the summer and how they actually perform when the election takes place, it almost invariably comes down. Gary Johnson got 1% of the vote in 2012. I think that there is some potential for a lot of disaffected Republicans and perhaps even some disaffected Democrats to decide that they want to cast a vote for Gary Johnson in 2012. Right now, I'd be surprised if that number was much more than 4 or 5%. In certain states, that could make a difference. But ultimately, the way I see the election developing right now, I don't see the election being close enough for him to throw it to one side or the other.
Maybe I missed it, but what are your thoughts on the female vote, where women go this time around? Not so much because of Hillary, but because of the things Donald Trump has said and done.
Excellent question, thank you. Most polling is showing right now that Hillary Clinton is performing in a very outsized way among female voters, that she is winning demographics among women voters that typically Democrats don't win. Married white women, for instance, moving into her camp. I really think that for the reasons that you mentioned, not just the historic aspect of Hillary Clinton being the first female major party nominee, but also because of a lot of the discomfort that many women voters have expressed regarding Donald Trump, I think we're going to see Hillary perform extremely well among women. And I see those margins being pretty significant and very difficult for Trump to overcome.
What kind of events could occur between now and November that might tip it the other way towards Trump?
You know, I think if we have some sort of massive terrorist attack, typically the Republican Party has been seen as stronger on terrorism. I think something like that could certainly make a difference. I think if somehow Donald Trump had a personality transplant and suddenly, became much more palatable to women, African Americans, Latinos, and every demographic group that isn't a white male, that maybe he might have a chance. But here's the bottom line, and I wrote a column for The Observer a couple of months ago in which the headline was, "There aren't enough angry white men to elect Donald Trump president." And that's the bottom line. Nobody has won a presidential election in America in 100 years on the strength of the white male vote.
Do you expect anything different at the convention other than him coming out with the nominee?
I really don't. I think it would be very, very difficult for that to happen. Today, in fact, the chair of the RNC, Reince Priebus, was working very hard to tamp down any kind of rules challenge that might bring that about. The bottom line is that Donald Trump goes in with a significant number of delegates who are pledged to him. These people didn't just become Trump pledges because they drew his name out of a hat. If they're going to the convention as an elected Trump delegate, they have an inclination to vote for Donald Trump. So I really think it would be very, very unlikely. As I said, I would probably put the chances of anything coming out other than a Donald Trump nomination somewhere in the neighborhood of 5% or less. Dan.
You mentioned that the Sanders supporters are saying now that they will not vote for Hillary. You think they may change their mind, I understand that. Is there any state where there's such a concentration of those supporters that if they did take that position, neither support Trump or stay home, where Trump would be at least possibly likely to pick up that state?
I think the likeliest places where that might happen, you have to look at some of the states in the Rust Belt where Sanders did very well in the Democratic primaries, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana, all of which he won. Indiana, very, very likely to go Republican anyway. In the end, I don't think there's going to be a very, very large number of Sanders supporters who withhold their support from the Democratic ticket. A more recent poll than the one I cited earlier indicated that at this point, 81% of Sanders supporters are grudgingly or not saying that they will vote for Hillary Clinton. He endorsed her earlier this week. I'm sure that will make some difference as well. I know there are some bitter enders who aren't happy about it, but I think in the end, the number of Sanders supporters who are going to ultimately not vote for Hillary Clinton probably will not be significant enough to make a difference. Janet.
What are your thoughts on the two-party system and the future of that? Because it seems to be fairly polarizing.
You know, American politics is, to a degree, unique in that if you look at other Western democracies, you find that major political parties typically do not last as long as the Republican and Democratic parties have lasted and have held their positions of dominance in American politics. The Democratic Party goes back to 1828 and has been one of the two major parties ever since. The Republican Party goes back to 1854 and has been one of the two major political parties ever since. That, as I said, is unusual in a Western democracy. The two parties over the course of the generations have changed positions on a number of issues. I think you could make a case that in some ways today's Republican Party and today's Democratic Party would be vastly, vastly different from the Republicans that you saw under Abraham Lincoln or Theodore Roosevelt or the Democrats that you saw under Woodrow Wilson. But I think what we're seeing right now is maybe more profound than just the changing of positions. There is very, very profound discontent on both sides. The Donald Trump nomination is case in point on the Republican side, how Republican voters or voters who may be inclined to vote Republican are so fed up with establishment politics and ideology that they have basically thrown the establishment out. On the Democratic side, you had an obscure 74-year-old socialist from Vermont who really gave Hillary Clinton, the party's anointed candidate, a very, very difficult time for a very long time. We're seeing people on both sides who feel very, very disaffected, who think that the two-party system is garbage, and really want to see massive changes. And it would be very hard, I think, to make a cogent prediction as to what's going to happen, but the Republican Party, as we used to know it, is already done. And I think the Democratic Party, as we know it, could be done in the next 4 to 8 years. What form that ultimately takes, who knows? Do the parties ultimately completely fall apart, or do they just change the way they do business? One of those two things I think is going to happen. I'm not sure which yet.
So given that, do you think Hillary will be a one-term or two-term president?
Great question. Unfortunately, the answer is it depends.
I know that.
Let me present two scenarios to you. The Republican Party comes back from this time of turmoil, takes its defeat, learns some lessons from it, and ultimately puts somebody forward in 2020 who's more acceptable to a larger share of the population. In that case, I think there's a very high likelihood that Hillary Clinton loses in 2020, unless she has some major successes. It is very, very unusual, as I noted earlier, for one party or the other to win 3 times in a row. I think that's going to happen this time. 4 times in a row, we haven't seen that since the 1940s, and that was because there was a fellow named FDR. So I think that the likelihood, if the Republicans get their act back together, of the Republicans winning in 2020, I would rate very high, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 to 60%. If, on the other hand, the Republican Party cannot put Humpty Dumpty back together and get its act together by 2020, then I think it's pretty clear that she would be likely to be reelected unless she had such a disastrous presidency that anybody would be considered preferable.
And how do you think history will treat Barack Obama?
It's a mixed bag, and it pains me to say that. I think a lot of people in the room know that I'm a Democrat. I think that he was very inspirational and was able to accomplish some things that I didn't think were possible. But I think that his ability to work with Congress has been pretty abysmal. And to a certain degree, that's because Congress refused to work with him. But you're always going to have some tug, some resistance from the other party, especially when that party comes into a new presidency with its back against the wall. I mean, the Republicans were in terrible shape in 2009, and they felt they had to hang together or they'd all hang separately. So I think it's going to be a mixed bag. I think that he has achieved some things that will be notable. Whether or not they'll be successful is another story. I think that his inability to really get a lot done legislatively will be the knock against him. We have a question from the back.
What's your opinion, if you have one, on the
And that's interesting because you'd think that with a libertarian ticket that most of their votes would be coming from Donald Trump. But polling shows that Johnson is actually taking slightly more from Hillary right now than he's taking from Trump. This is not something I would have anticipated. Again, in the end, I think that it's going to be a negligible effect. As I mentioned earlier, very, very rarely does a third party or independent candidate do as well in November as his polling numbers showed in June or July. And if you want any more confirmation of that, let's talk to President Perot.
Let's take one more question back over there.
Yeah, I'm curious how the polling's changed after James Comey came out with his recommendation and report. And I ask that just because my very unscientific observation is that the Bernie Sanders voters that are, in my opinion, going that way, anti-establishment, they seem to be extremely upset with the report and the recommendation. But it sounds like you still believe that those voters are in the end are going to come back to Hillary, although it seems like those people are at least as upset, if not more upset, than the Republican voter. So can you comment on that? And I'm curious if there's been polls since post Comey's recommendation.
I think that certainly it has raised some questions. Comey's comments were damning in many ways, but ultimately he didn't find enough to recommend any kind of criminal charges. I do believe that time heals some wounds. We're still in July. I think that a lot of it will be probably forgotten. The public has a very short memory span by the time we get to November. And I think ultimately what you're going to see is that people who are of a particular ideological bent are going to end up supporting the candidate who best reflects their own views, who has a legitimate chance to win. I think you're going to see more votes for third-party candidates this year than you typically see. In the last election, Gary Johnson got 1%, and Jill Stein got 0.5%. Those numbers will come up some. I don't believe they're going to come up enough to affect the outcome of this election because I don't think that the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump is going to be especially close. Thank you.